Jacques Ellul and Bernard Charbonneau are known primarily for their extensive and heavy critiques of technology's scope and power in the modern world. As a part of such critiques, they studied and were concerned by the ways modern technologies shaped the perception and production of art. Ellul writes in What I Believe, technique produces a totalizing ideology from which people can no longer be distant, simply because this process of symbolization and distancing, which was once a specific and integral part of art, is now completely devalued and rendered meaningless, watered down, and even ridiculous by technological activity, which does not symbolize and is only efficacious. He elaborates these critiques at lengths in books like Empire of Nonsense and Humiliation of the Word, and for that reason, it's possible for people to conclude that neither Ellul nor Charbonneau were engaged in art in general and the art of their time in particular. But there's evidence to the contrary throughout their lives and work. For example, Ellul writes in Humiliation of the Word, "I'm not trying to minimize the importance of the image. I only mean to specify its domain and understand its limits. The image is an admirable tool for understanding reality. In the social or political world, it can even be explosive and terribly efficacious. Without Bread by Luis Buñuel and Our Daily Bread by King Vidor are admirable films for their ability to convict and unsettle people's good conscience. They are genuinely revolutionary. A documentary film of a riot enables us to penetrate the world of another better than any speech could. But an image is explosive only if the spectator knows what it represents and if it is taken for what it is, a faithful representation of reality." So, Ellul and Charbonneau did engage with art and did think it was possible for art to transform people and things, even to the point of being explosive. It's for that reason you will hear me say in this conversation with iconographer Kelly Latimore that I have a hunch Ellul would appreciate his work, even though Ellul does come down quite strongly on iconography in his writing. The question is, why do I have this hunch? Well, as I think this conversation will show the further you get into it, Kelly Latimore's iconography constitutes this faithful, transformative, and explosive representation of reality that Ellul called for. For that reason, I'm pleased to share this conversation with you, and if you're listening to it, make sure to take some time to watch it as well, because images of Kelly's work and other artworks mentioned appear throughout our discussion. And with that, here's my conversation with Kelly Latimore. His full bio and relevant links can be found in the show notes. So let's start very, very simply. For people who don't know you, who is Kelly Latimore? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, yeah, thanks again for having me, Michael. Well, I'm an artist and iconographer based in Burlington, Vermont right now. Been painting for a long time, but specifically doing icons since 2010. Um, I I kind of stumbled upon iconography, and we can talk more about it, but um, it's a very communal art, and so my partner Evie and I get to engage with a lot of communities and talking about images all across mainly United States and some in the UK, and getting to enter into kind of conversations that are already happening in different communities and communities of faith and churches, and uh, and it's been now 10, yeah, almost 10 years of doing that. So, or
Okay,
longer, 15, excuse me.
15.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's all a blur. If you
Yeah.
include the pandemic within that, you're like, do those years count? And if
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
how much? So when did you first discover art? Like, were you one of those kids that, as far back as you can remember, were painting or drawing or that sort of thing, or was it more of a slow burn for you?
I've always been making art. I'm actually a PK, a pastor's kid, and so I just remember like sitting in church and just absolutely covering the bulletin with like doodles and drawings and using like the words as like part of it and little scenes. So I've always been making art, but it wasn't until I went to Greenville University, which is in Southern Illinois. I started as a music major and just hated the academic music world and music theory, and so I dropped out. And I didn't know what I was gonna do, and so but I ended up. My mentor, he and professor, he's like, "Why don't you just take whatever you want, and then we'll regroup." And so when I actually got to choose what I wanted to study, it was religion and art, and so that's what I ended up majoring in was religion and art, which ended up working out perfectly later. But yeah, so that's kind of how I've always been making art, and I just kind of carried that uh, through after graduating and doing portrait work and landscape work, and then uh, really it was through being in that community when I really started making icons. So
So you mentioned being a pastor's kid. So did you grow up in a tradition where you were surrounded with religious art, or did you grow up in a more low church tradition where you weren't necessarily surrounded by icons and statues and what would be considered high church tradition?
it was very low church. I think the artwork it was very sparse in the church I grew up. And there were only three pieces in the entire church, and they were all by the same man, Werner Salman. His most famous piece is called "The Head of Christ," or they call it the Protestant icon. It's like a '70s like yearbook photo of Jesus, like blonde, hair, blue-eyed man. And that was in kind of like the narthex. And then there's another really one that he did of Jesus knocking on the door, harking back to Luke. I stand at the door and knock, and that was strangely above the baby changing table in the nursery. So it was just like it was very the artwork was like really spread out, but it was very sparse. But the interesting thing about that piece and is I've thought about it a lot because it was really popular. The Warner Solomon Head of Christ, and I've talked to so many people now that they grew up with that image of the white Jesus in their churches. Like it was just kind of dominated, kind of locked Jesus into one image, specifically in the evangelical church and the church Catholic, and that was the main image that most people had. So that's pretty kind of burned into my memory.
Yeah, for a lot of people it is, and we'll get into this later because I do want to talk about your depictions of Christ and, Christ's family and so on, and how you're going against the grain of that typical sort of white Scandinavian looking Jesus, or the sort of like Eurocentric Jesus, where it's kind of like it could be a Spanish Jesus, but it could also be Italian. It could be right. And I actually grew up surrounded with a lot of that imagery. Just my father's side of the family immigrated from Italy when he was one, and so they are Roman Catholic. My dad is part of the Anglican Church now, but I grew up with surrounded by the Eurocentric Jesus, and to this day, sometimes I get cards from family members with the that person, and um, seeing my children engage with it and having conversations with them about what Jesus actually looked like and how Jesus is present with us today. It's a long process, and that's why I ask, is I'm just interested in how people grow up. And if you grow up in lower church traditions or Protestant traditions, the imagery tends to be pretty limited, and there's the iconoclasm goes very, very deep, and so there's this suspicion of too much imagery, too many statues, and the idolatry that might creep in. But that raises a whole host of questions around, okay, but what do we fill our churches with if we don't fill it with what we think of when we think of religious art? So now it's
Right.
screens, it's lights, it's the fog machines, and those are just as prone to being idolized.
Yeah, I mean, I think over the last 2 years, I'd say one of my main questions I've been asking, and it's very simple, but what is our church art for? Is it glorified wallpaper, or could it actually be something that's forming us and changing us? And you're absolutely right. I think so much of the modern church kind of leaning into like an auditorium or like entertainment type of items and a way of doing a service and communing together really does say something about how those churches are wanting to be and to form themselves as congregations. And it's more about it's more about the show. It's more about like grabbing the attention rather than necessarily the community engaging with one another. And so, I obviously am an iconographer, and I could talk about the roots of the history of church art and over the years, specifically iconography. But I'm way more interested in iconography in the sense of how it's being used to transform us and to have this almost conversion of sight that can potentially happen, but within the context of community and doing that work together of observing a piece of art as a community and then the conversations that could potentially happen within that, I think can really, really change us as people. And so I'm really much more interested in, uh, you know, conversations and images that are going to kind of create that genuine connection and conversation within our communities of faith specifically, and how we worship and how these images are in a space, and then how we commune with them. This mutual participation in art. Like, what is that? So
Yeah, so you talk about this as a communal thing, not an individual thing. And can you speak to actually maybe some of the practices that you engage in order to make it more than just an individual putting your art out into the world and then individuals viewing it, but how does it become a communal event, as it were? And you talk about conversion as you're engaging with these pieces. Are there specific practices that you engage in order to create space for that to happen?
yeah, I mean, one of the recently in May, I was going to do an icon ready class with some nuns in Cincinnati, and with a lot of religious communities right now, they're all quite old. The women there, and a lot of them just didn't feel comfortable painting, and so a week before the retreat, they emailed me and say, "Can we actually just talk about icons?" And I was like, "Yes, like yeah, we could figure this out." But what I ended up doing is I still wanted to make them work. And so, you've heard the Jesuit practice of lectio divina. Well, there's also kind of this, it's been around for a while, but visio divina, meditating and praying with images. And so, what I ended up doing, I took some of my work, but also like uh, a bunch of different artwork, not even religious, from across many centuries, some modern, some more traditional and older, and some of my own work, and we just observed together. And and then after a while, I would give a little bit of time, and then I'd open it up if there's a one word that came to mind that as you're looking at it. Um, and then it opened it up again, and then we could kind of more of a conversation about these works. Well, it was just so beautiful because even images that I've looked at, for decades or more, like these, 95-year-old nun had some insight into a piece or into the biblical story that I had never thought about. And it was just hearing each other kind of see and then observe then brings a new perspective that I might not have seen in myself or ever thought about. And so I think that's this Visio Divina practice is something that I think is really interesting. And I'm curious about doing more of, not only as an artist and iconographer, but as this way that as communities, we can learn something from hearing from one another, and what we're seeing. And One more quick example. There's a community and retreat center called Transforming Center. It's in Chicago, and part of their retreats is they use some of the icons that I've done and some traditional icons in a similar type of space where they're observing. And the one piece I've done called Mama, they have there. It's a black Madonna and Christ in the Pietà style, the dead body of Christ. And when they show people that image, there's been people that, really are offended by it, that Jesus is depicted as black and Mary as black. I mean, there was a older man who was really offended by it, but was just didn't make sense to him because he was a white man, but who had adopted a black son. I'm like, what did that mean to be, kind of almost disgusted by an image of a black Christ? So I think those kind of practices are just kind of one of the ways that we've been kind of engaging with images, but and how they kind of inform our communities and one another and that relationship.
Yeah, and I'm familiar with the icon that you're mentioning here, and I've actually used that in a class before, among others. And I think the class that I used it, I used that as the last image I showed students, and that
Mm,
was close to the time that George Floyd was executed by a police officer in public. And the the reaction to viewing that, I mean, it was stunned and pregnant silence, I would say. And I talked to students like, how do you feel looking at this? And they acknowledged that it was very difficult.
mm,
But watching different students, depending on their backgrounds, like what made it uncomfortable for them and how they were uncomfortable, it
mm.
differed depending on the story brought to it. And I do want to explore a little bit about the effect that your work has later on, but I do want to dial back a little bit just to understand when you converted or became an iconographer, because in I've read a little bit about you and you talk about 2010 being a pivotal year. So what was it about that year where you made this shift to become an iconographer?
After college, I kind of had like most students that graduate, kind of I could either move back in with my parents or kind of go somewhere else. And so I ended up going somewhere else. But ended up moving to Athens, Ohio, and met a couple who had started this community called the Common Friars, which was a community, and we based our life on the Book of Common Prayer, praying together every day, and common meals and common space. But the main mission of the place was a food pantry farm. And really, I would say a lot of my upbringing in the evangelical tradition. I mean, my dad and I talk about this all the time now, but it was really almost about transcendence, like Jesus and I versus the world almost, which is a really damaging way to live. But going there, I mean, not only at university, but then entering into this community where I was milking a cow at 5:30 in the morning and 5:30 at night. We were praying together. We were growing food for the food insecure, but a lot of people in shelters would come and join us in that work. And you know, weeding a bed of carrots with a complete stranger in the conversations, like it just showed me how the way that we use things is of the utmost spiritual significance. And in that context and making art in that context, it just my spirituality stopped really being about transcendence and more about communion, engagement, embodiment, like how we are in the world. And so within that, I had been making art, and one of the priests who was in our community, Father Tom, said he just literally asked me. He said, "Had you ever tried painting an icon?" And I had it, and I just got really curious. And I didn't have a master iconographer with me. I was kind of was learning on my own, but I just started doing what all artists do, but iconographers specifically, is I just started tracing. I just started finding these, they call them icon patterns in books, and tracing them and transferring them on boards and trying my hand at it. And I did that for a long time. Just creating, copying these traditional icons. Well, I did that for a while, but after a bit, I was kind of putting the puzzle pieces together. And my best friend Paul used to say, as we're being farmers and tending to one another, like, how do we also have like a right relationship with the earth? And as Jesus would say, how do we consider the lilies of the field? Like, what does that mean? And so that, like, scripture became the focus of my first icon, which is called Christ Consider the Lilies. Now, if you see it, it's a good first try. Like, the lines are shaky. Uh, One of my Franciscan friar friends likes to say it almost looks like Jesus is surprised that the lilies are in his hand. I was learning the forms, trying to become a better painter, and still am. But what was beautiful about that, though, um, is that the community embraced it, and I think they embraced it because it was a part of our common experience. And they put that image on the chapel in our prayer space. But what it really did is it showed me how, um, you know, that artwork, what it can potentially do is it could be a placeholder for not only a community's thought and its prayer, but most importantly, its action and how we are in the world. And really from there, it just kind of things just kind of snowballed. People saw that and say, oh, could you paint an icon of Saint Michael for my nephew Michael, or could you paint Saint Peter for me? Just these little images. And I did that for several years until finally painted a piece called the Sacred of Familia, which is actually the first icon I put online.
I'm not sure how familiar you are with the work of Ellul and Charbonneau, but Ellul was very concerned about the modern era and the oversaturation of imagery. And
Mm,
of course, being a good Protestant Reformed individual, his concern that was the oversaturation of images, which he ties to modern technology, will reduce our ability to hear God, right? It'll
mm,
reduce our ability to hear the word. And that was a huge concern of his throughout his writing. And yet he also clarifies as strong as he comes down on imagery and visual culture in a book like Humiliation of the Word, he does also love the arts and advocate for the type of attentiveness to the arts and contemplation that you're describing here. And I think this kind of practice seems to me to be all the more important to learn how to engage images well
mm.
in a world overrun with images, some of which are pregnant with meaning, and some you really, really got to dig, and some it's not at all, right? I'm thinking about
Right.
meme culture and even not even being able to trust what we see anymore, not being able
Mm,
to trust what is coming across our screen, whether it's news images or whether it's AI generated and these sorts of things. I think what you're describing as as a community practice of discernment and formation, I think offers a constructive and critical way to navigate all of these images. And further, I think this is why the personalists stress time in nature, time getting your hands in the dirt, time being in the wild elements, because you become someone who is put back in your body in those moments. You're not the person who's doom scrolling on your phone and, oh, that's a nice image, I'm going to like that, and oh, that's a funny meme, and oh, I'm going to send all these reels to my friends. And don't get me wrong, I love doing all of that with my pals, but what you're even you just describing these practices, there's something in me that says I crave that. And I
mm,
think a lot of people crave that. And of course, you're doing it within the Christian tradition. But one of the things that the personalists advocated for is that, you don't necessarily have to come from that perspective in order to engage some of these practices.
Hmm.
Um, and I think, how can we partner with other people and invite them into this type of contemplation? And I think that is the power of your work, where you're modernizing your icons, where in taking that classic iconography, but modernizing it a bit to help us be attentive to our surroundings. So, for example, the George Floyd piece that we were talking about, the migrant family, represented as Jesus and Mary and Joseph, right?
Hmm.
These are ways to invite people in to contemplate the possible presence of God in our midst, not some transcendent, holy other God who's judging us from afar.
Right.
Yes, transcendent and powerful, but also very much present in the here and now, in people and the dirt and the flowers and so on, which is kind of hidden in plain sight in the Gospels, right? Jesus is always pointing at the earth and the flowers
Yes.
and the seeds and the birds and coins and pearls and these very indiscreet or discrete objects, and saying, I'm here. I'm here in those, and I'm here in the people.
Hmm.
um, so you just said it kind of snowballed. It kind of took on shape where you were apprenticing, as it were, not with a particular sort of master iconographer, but in tracing the classic icons. You kind of, it seems to be, you're like apprenticing in the communion of saints almost. But do you
Yeah.
remember when you had that aha moment where you said, "Okay, I'm gonna take a step out here and go beyond the classic. I'm gonna stick to the classic forms, but I'm also gonna modernize in a bit." Can you pinpoint a moment or moments when you had that, like, I'm gonna do this?
Yeah, I think it was kind of a commonwealth of a few things that were happening at once. Right around the time I painted La Sacreda Familia, this modern uh, Latinx family in the desert in modern clothes. I was also painting an image of the Trinity, using kind of one of the most famous icons, which is Andrei Rublev's Trinity of the three angels seated at the table from the story of Abraham and Sarah, entertaining them. And what was interesting is, and doing research for that, it's again taking that icon, that traditional icon, and was at the time reinterpreting it as it was a commission for a priest in New York City, and was reinterpreting it as women of color. So it was women, but also as women of color seated around the table, and playing with those metaphors. This time they're holding hands instead. Uh, there's different colors. There's the imagery of rainbow. There's instead of the communion and bread or wine and bread being on the table, it's grapes and wheat. And the priest kind of wanted that metaphor in there, almost as to say, we still have work to do. Um, but in playing with that, I was really realized that you know the iconographers, that's one of the most famous icons, but the iconographers at the time, in order to come up with something to represent the Trinity, they had to kind of dig through the scriptures and come up with something, an imagery at that time. And at that time, that the clothes that they were wearing could have been more modern, who knows. But so every artist is kind of looking at the thing kind of going on in their time, and as it kind of reinterpret the biblical stories and how we see them and how we see Christ and Mary and Joseph and the saints. So when I'm thinking about that, it didn't seem like that big of a leap to, you know, it was during the 2016 election, and there was all of these, Christians who were, uh, you know, uh, par- parroting Trump's, anti-immigrant, anti-stranger rhetoric. And Evie and I, having known, very well undocumented people, they immediately came to mind and their stories. And this young man we met in Guatemala around a bonfire, and like his hopes and his fears and why he came to the United States, and like it just was all there. And so we were thinking at the time in 2016, like, what's an image that we could create that goes to this Matthew 25, like the least of these, like these people, immigrants and refugees are being used as a scapegoat for all the America's quote unquote problems. Like, what's an image we could create that using these traditional forms of a halo and Greek script to indicate Christ, baby Christ, and all these things that we recognize from iconography, but carrying them into present where it's the Holy Family, but it's the Holy Family as the least of these, but really to show the inherent sacredness within people who are being vilified in our country, the immigrant and the foreigner. And so again, I think what it did is when I released that image online, there's many people who really embraced the image and thought it was beautiful and helpful for them. There, at the same time, we got a ton of pushback, and that pushback being Christians, as best I could say, trying to protect their version of God that they had built up in their head. But that's the thing: when you try to protect God, you can be pretty sure you're protecting your own version of God, which is the exact opposite of an icon. It's more of an idol. So, it was really interesting, kind of the dialogue that was happening just online with that in different communities, and now as time's gone on, I've heard later kind of some of those conversations firsthand that have happened. Um, but yeah, that was really a lot of the process. It was just, it didn't seem like a big leap to kind of carry those metaphors and symbols and forms of iconography into a modern context. Yeah.
Yeah, and for people who aren't familiar with the tradition of iconography, could you share a little bit about the theology behind it? Because I think it's important to specify that, and this is what I tell people when I share your work or the work of other iconographers. It's not as if the iconographers are saying this is the definitive portrayal of the Trinity or Jesus or a saint, right? This is
Mhm.
a portrayal, and I'm going to emphasize particular elements. And it's through the emphasis of this element or elements that I'm going to get you to contemplate a specific aspect of this person or a specific characteristic or story associated with the Trinity or with God. Um, do you feel like that's an accurate representation of the tradition of iconography? And what you're doing is you're saying, I'm not necessarily saying that this is the only way to view the Trinity, but this is one way in which we can appreciate how God seems to be in the habit of showing up and defying all expectations. And so,
Absolutely.
right? And usually it's through people that you least expect, right? So yeah, could you speak a little bit to the sort of classic theology and philosophy behind iconography that's informing this work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is as you mentioned before, Michael, I think it is like a entering into a communion of saints. And I think that the tradition was really rich and kind of you're placing yourself in the pattern, you're placing yourself in the tracing as a way to uh, almost like muscle memory. It's making a habit of showing up, doing the work, and then how are you informed or how are you changed by doing that? It's just like, it's like a prayer. When you say a prayer, over and over again, you memorize it slowly will kind of inform you and or change you in a way. And so but it has a very obviously very specific, artistic implications and learning how to paint and learning how to, uh, you know, paint the clothing of a traditional icon and what have you. But I think it for them, that's why I was for a long time called writing an icon is almost like you're uh, dictating scripture, writing down scripture. It was, following these lines and placing yourself in these lines that have come from before. But it was a lot of the master iconographers. Once you had gotten down a specific image, there was very much a tradition of never make one icon this. You always change something about it, a little bit. But I really think that kind of placing yourself in the tracing is just an act of understanding the saints in the tradition that's come from before, but then how do you then carry it uh into the present or into your life and how you live. All that being said, if I'm going to look at an image, and I've now almost always going back before I'm creating a lot of the icons I'm doing, I'm going back and looking at a lot of the early work and kind of these different depictions of Madonna and Child and Christ, and really using them to like as those lines. But if I'm going to change something, I better have a pretty good theological reason why. And so that's kind of come into it now, is following these traditional lines and what these artists, how these artists were even struggling with the personhood of Jesus and God and the saints, but now doing that in this time. And um, for instance, in Mama, this traditional, more Byzantine style icon of the Pietà, and a black mother and son. Usually, she's looking at the dead Christ figure in those images. And when Evie and I, in the tracing and doing the original lines, Evie suggested, and rightly so, like, what if we had her actually looking at the viewer, almost to say, like, what are we going to do so this doesn't keep happening? Where mothers are continually losing their sons and their daughters who are unjustly murdered by the state now, just as Jesus was 2,000 years ago. And by making that subtle change, even though it wasn't traditional, I think it really it was a theological reason to do it, but I think it really ended up making an impact. It's not ignoring or um, you know just disrespecting the lines that have come from before from previous iconographers, but it's really by making that change, it's a theological statement. And so I think as just as those early iconographers were struggling and kind of making their way through the theology of the artwork, then I think I've wanted to kind of take a lot of that philosophy and the tradition and how then I'm changing or making new icons in my time. So
Yeah, and that doesn't just speak to iconography. Like as I hear you talk, I'm thinking about so many artistic forms within
right,
painting, right? But also music. Um,
yes,
it's like blues music. Before you break the rules, you have to learn them. So when you
right,
break them, you know which rules you're breaking and why you're breaking them.
right,
And I even think about my journey of getting tattoos and always wanting to, but never actually doing it until I had my sort of midlife crisis. I tell people I couldn't afford a motorbike, so I just went with ink instead. But the way in which you learn the art of tattooing and how you apprentice and how familiar are you with the sort of background of tattooing, like the whole flash sheets, right? So
right,
it's artists imitating other artists' work, but you take the stencil and then you build on it. And I remember the first tattoo I had where we agreed on the design. I didn't see it till the day of because this is how the guy I work with works. And so I come in and he shows me the image and it was an outline. It wasn't the final product.
right,
And that's when I realized Wow, if you're getting ink done, make sure you trust the artist because you don't know what it's going to look like until the
That's
end,
right. That's
right?
right.
So look at their work, but this extends like it applies to iconography, but it extends to so many different artistic forms, is where it can often in our hyper individualistic age be presented as an individual genius, who sets
Mm,
themselves apart from the rest. But actually, how many of the people who are doing unique work spend a significant amount of time learning the forms, repeating the forms before you transcend it a little bit in that breaking of the rules and the innovation? Ellul wrote a lot on art, and he was quite critical of modern art and popular art in his time because he thought art, like most everything in the modern world, had become too technological.
mm,
And you can mistake him as not being engaged with the arts given how critical he is, but he was very engaged and loved some modern artists actually. I mean, he loved Salvador Dali, for example. Uh he had the Last Supper image that Dali did like above his bed in his bedroom. Like his
oh
grandson
wow.
told me this, right? And I mean, that's such an interesting painting. Like it really unsettles me, right? Because it's all, Jesus and all the disciples pictured as these ethereal Scandinavians. But it's a surrealistic, ironic art piece where it's saying clearly they weren't this. But what
Mm,
this does is it unsettles you to picture what they must have actually looked like. But all that to say, he did have some hope for
mm,
modern art. But his primary critique was it's relying too much on technique, like the quickest way to get something done for the highest yield. And I don't get the sense that this is your way of doing work. And I don't, of course, want to speak on Will's behalf, but your work is the kind that I would wonder if he were alive today, how he would engage. I think he would like what you're
mm,
doing. I really
mm,
do, because he said the role of the artist is to, he doesn't say it explicitly like this, but almost act like a prophet.
mm,
So showing the world what's kind of hidden in plain sight, or forcing us to apprehend that which we don't want to see or acknowledge. And and also to engage with symbols and engage with them in such a way that we're showing people the richness of who God is and how God is at work in the world. But he says in an age that's hyper technological, the possibility of symbols just decreases and decreases. So this is
mm,
a long preamble of me asking, what is your relationship with technology in your work?
mm.
Like, can you tell us a little bit about the creative process, the methods you use, the materials you use, you don't use, and what's sort of going on in your mind as you're making those decisions?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I'll start off by saying one of my favorite quotes. It's by Reverend Samuel Wells. He was at Duke University for a long time, but a British theologian and priest, and he, said, problem with technology is it promises a better world without requiring us to become better people." And I think for me, I've always gravitated towards the just the artistic methods that are keep me attentive and keep uh really, I am very visceral with the work and stuff that I like doing. Like I like painting. And so I really think that, with technology, um and art, I mean, I love also another Brit, David Hockney, talks a lot about this, that he was someone for a long time, he had done painting and drawing and then came to photography. But he has this beautiful insight that, with painting is where the photograph, time stands still, it's just there. But with a painting, like it's a series of time, it's a series of moments, that it's extended time, attentive time. And I think that, really he's explaining the exact kind of same thing as probably the iconographers would have when they say that while they're painting, they're praying, It's the same kind of attention. Um, and really for me, I think what it means to be human and what it means to be an artist is trying to learn how to be more present. And uh, and I think what happens is for a lot of the images, I will start and I'll have a very clear vision, um, and and then I have to put it down. I have to stop. I mean, as an example, I think this gets to a lot of things that we've been talking about. But when I was first starting out, I did a very traditional icon of Christ the Pantocrator. So it's Christ of the Gospel book, having the blessing hands, very traditional, famous icon, Mosaic and Sinai as well. But so I started it. Well, this is really ridiculous, but I was still kind of learning iconography and working on it. But I ended up calling it Baby Hands Jesus because like his face was right, but his hands were like really tiny and like disproportionate. And I was like, so I got really frustrated and I put it on a shelf. Well, like 2 years went by and uh, I got some new gold leaf and I hadn't tried before and I just wanted to try it on something and I found that old icon. I was like, I didn't like this anyway. So I just hastily gold leafed over it, specifically a part of the face. And when I looked at it, I noticed that, it looked just like a plain gold leaf board, but because I'd reworked the icon so much with the paint, the raised face of Christ was there. And I was like, oh, this is something. And so I gold leafed over the whole thing. Well, later, uh, two priests who are friends of mine came into my studio that day and they immediately saw it and they both pointed at it and they said, that's the cloud of unknowing. And I was like, what? And for just briefly, for people who don't know, because I didn't know at the time, Cloud of Unknowing is an anonymous work written by a monk. And we're really, he's saying, and I'm paraphrasing quite briefly, but that the more that knowledge will only get us so far to knowing God, but the more we put God under a cloud of forgetting or a cloud of unknowing, the closer we'll be to God through the heart and our experience. And so, what was interesting is like they named it; those priests named it, and so therefore it had become a new gift to me. So, in my attentiveness to know that this was something, and just trying something out, then it became a gift to the priest, the viewer, the power then extended to the viewer and then it became then a gift back to me after they named it. And so I really think that that gets at the heart of the not only the risk but also the attentiveness that and prayerfulness it takes to be an artist and trying to be more present, but also the power of the work after it's viewed and that work has been done by me and then seen. It became a new gift to me and then therefore I was able to see it in a new way. And I think that that's kind of the really what, and there's a beautiful book by Dorothy Sayers called The Mind of a Maker, where she talks about this kind of the power of the viewer and the artist. But I think that that is, again, it wasn't a traditional icon, it was just a plain gold leaf board. But I think it said something more than I had realized. And I paint that different versions of it all the time. But really, I think there's materials or all these things, and I like to use paint, but I think the attentiveness is really the work that it I'm continually learning how to see and train myself how to see well and rightly and take the right things for granted. And that'll be a lifelong thing. But um, yeah, uh,
That is very interesting, and you also talk quite a lot about your partner's role in your work. So tell me a little bit about that.
I mean, uh, she's an amazing person. Obviously, that's why I'm with her. But when uh, there's been several images that I've done, and then we'll stop. I'll kind of stop, and we'll look at it together and things will shift and change. But then there's been icons that we've, kind of collaborated on right from the start. And she commissioned a piece called uh, "Keep Watch," which is based off of the Compline prayer in the Book of Common Prayer in the Episcopal and Anglican tradition. It's a beautiful Compline prayer, and she just wanted a Black Madonna and Child, at night in the stars, and it was so fun to paint. Like we collaborated on it. It's a beautiful little piece. But still, so many people really connect to that prayer, and so the image became really special because of that. To this example I said before, Mama, where I had planned out this whole image of the Pietà, but Evie rightly saying like, what if we change the eyes, and it completely changed the piece for the better. And so, I think uh, in the artistic creation process of icons, it's been an immense gift. But also, not only Evie, but when I've the commission works, when this has happened, has also been incredibly moving and a gift. I did in Salisbury, North Carolina, St. Luke's Episcopal Church. They commissioned two large works for me: Pentecost, and then the Transfiguration. But when we met to talk about the work before I created it, we met with the arts committee, and one of the women said, I really want Christ's robes to be dazzling white. And a Black woman who was also in the group spoke up and said, I'm actually really uncomfortable with that, the whiteness of Christ. Is there another way that we could talk about it and think about it? And then that led us to, well, what if we did his robes weren't white at all? And then I suggested, what if we use silver leaf, almost like a mirror, which has ended up what we ended up doing. And it ended up being a way better icon because that kind of difficult conversation happened. When the light hits it in that space, it just scatters all over. It's more of kind of what the transfiguration probably really is anyway. But as just as another example, I think that is one of my favorite parts about iconography. It is a very communal art. Not only me with Evie and our partnership, but also engaging with communities and how they're wanting to see themselves in the world, but how then these scenes or depictions of Jesus or a particular saint are really informing that as well. And you know, I'm kind of entering into this dialogue and then kind of cobbling together little pieces here and there to create these images. But I don't think I would be doing that if I was doing other types of artwork.
Yeah, well, hearing you speak, it strikes me that there's a whole world and community behind every piece that you do. And I think this actually speaks to my hunch that Ellul would like what you're doing, because when I asked you about your approach, when I asked you about your methods, you didn't talk about techniques. You talked about people. You talked about your sensory engagement with the world and your willingness to give time for a piece's meaning to emerge, and you're willing to adjust as you go. And you don't seem to start with the question, what material should I use? But what's the vision? And who do I invite into that process? And how can the vision emerge over time? I say this
Mm,
all the time in terms of the work that I do as a scholar or even as a musician. The real magic happens when you invite other people into it.
yes. Mhm.
And in our hyper individualized world, I do invite people into my work or offer to engage with other people's work and give them feedback because I care and want to support them and help. And some people welcome it, but there's also a reaction sometimes it's like taken as an offense. You don't think I'm capable? Like, and it's not
Right.
like I get that direct response, but at times when you suggest collaboration, some people bristle a little bit. Like it's as if you're suggesting that you don't think that they can do it on their own. And that's just not what I'm suggesting. I'm saying I'm interested in what you're doing and I want to
Mm,
get involved in that process, right? And this is kind of the experience of doing a PhD for me is you have this vision where you go in and you think, oh, I'm going to be the sole genius who just, you know, comes up with all these theorems and proves them to be true and change the world. And it's like, no, 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 no. You don't come up with any original thought until you read everything on your subject. And only then, once you've sort of surveyed the landscape and you have a grasp of it, only then can you speak with a little bit of certainty on what people are missing.
Mm,
Oh, and then when you're done, have five of your friends read it to help you say it better because they will. And do you trust them enough to do that? And that's precisely the journey I went through. But I
mm,
feel like so much of our world hides that reality,
mm,
or they feel like they have to do it alone and their work isn't what it could be if they were simply to engage, right?
mm,
It's like a sign of weakness or shame to engage in that communal process. So I really it helps me appreciate like the communities that are a part of your work that
mm,
as someone who's just got connected with your work online, you tend to envision the individual. Um,
mm,
So now I want to talk about the effects that your work have because you've spoken about them, the reactions that you get, some positive, some negative, and I've actually been in situations myself using your work teaching, and I've experienced both positive reactions and pushback or discomfort. So I have two examples that I wanted to share, and I'd love to hear your thinking on them. So the first one is about the image that you have of the family, the migrant family, the Latinx family in the desert, represented as the um, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. I had a student who came up to me after the class that I shared it, and they said they understood what the artist was trying to do and they appreciated the effort and they appreciated my use of it and what I was sort of using that as a leaping off point to talk about Matthew 25 or the Sermon on the Mount and how Christ is present today in the people whom a lot of our world is saying like we would least expect him to be
mm.
present in. But he really struggled with the fact that it wasn't, a quote unquote historically accurate portrayal, right? That it wasn't an ancient Near Eastern, um, Jewish family.
Right.
And so me being me, I gave him a long sort of history of iconography, kind of like what we were doing earlier. It's like, well, he's not saying that Jesus and his parents are literally this family, but but then I also just asked, like, yeah, but do you get uncomfortable with renderings of Jesus in this sort of white Eurocentric piece? And there was just kind of a silence there. And so this is one of the things that I've realized about your work is that it surfaces our presuppositions or perhaps even our prejudices, um, ones that we may be unconscious of. And
Right.
your work is surfacing that, which I think produces that kind of negative reaction. I mean, is that kind of what you're seeing a lot when you're sharing your work and getting some of those pushbacks?
Yeah. I mean, really, the Sacred Familia was kind of the first version of that. Mama really amped up when about a year after we released that. Well, when we released it in 2020, I ended up we didn't sell that icon. We had just kind of created it with a kind of a close knit community of friends and people, and we ended up giving it to a parish that where a priest ended up is now our good friend, and that parish got like death threats, like threat, all kinds of threats, like from trad or traditional Catholic church that was close by that wanted to come and burn it. And so they actually had a police officer, which is kind of ironic, coming by every Sunday, driving near the church just to make sure nothing was happening. To then a year after that, I donated a print, or a print was given to Catholic University of America for their law school, and it would end up being stolen 3 times. Um, but
Which print
really,
was
I
that?
mean, it was a print of Mama. So it
Oh,
was a
okay,
print
right.
of the Mama
Yeah,
piece.
I see.
Yeah, and it was stolen 3 times. And there was this big kind of, all these news outlets were talking about it, and the president of the university, kind of balked. Like at first, this really interesting conversation could have happened, but he didn't quite want to go there. So it's really interesting in that sense, like to see all of these things. Um, and so with that piece, people kept on asking, like, is it George Floyd or Jesus? And after like reflecting on it for a while, Evie and I were like, probably the most faithful answer we could say was yes, which actually frustrated a lot of people. Like that dualistic question is fine for the sake of conversation, but not for the sake of the truth. Like it is Christ. But as Mother Teresa of Calcutta said, it's also Christ in a just distressing disguise, Matthew 25. But Christ says he is to be found in those, the least of these, and those who suffer, just as George Floyd did. So therefore, it is George Floyd.
Yeah.
So, but 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 more to the point in your question, and this is really observation about that piece from my friend Mark Bizzuti Jones, Father Mark Bizzuti Jones. He likes to say that icons can be, you know, everything we said, a window to God, a window to a saint, or someone who lived a life full of compassion and in the, trying to be Christ in the world, right? But icons can also be iconoclastic in the sense of breaking images, because there's something about the image of God, the Imago Dei, that will always be resisted, and that there's something about the image of God that will always be crucified because we continue to crucify each other. We continue to fail to see the inherent sacredness in the other and one another. And so that's why I think it's really interesting is that, for your student to say, look at really, this is not the literal Holy Family. It's saying that we're all, in a sense, icons of God, made in His likeness. And to quote James Cone, to dismiss the image of God in anyone is a complete denial of the incarnation, right? So I think that's playing with the iconoclastic nature that icons can potentially do is very interesting to me and Evie and a lot of the work that we do. And so it's not creating an icon for pushback's sake. It's just that when you creating an image like Mama, is that I'm now not surprised when the pushback happens. But I'm just really holding out hope that people, your students, other people around me can open themselves up to new images of God, or places showing up in the people that maybe we would least expect. And I think the conversations that really happened from a lot of those quote unquote iconoclastic icons have been the most interesting and hard, but also beautiful. I like to say, will we be end up being like Peter in the gospel, when we're asked, when we're by the fire, when he's by the fire in the gospel, will we stand with Christ in his suffering? Or when we're asked the hard questions, will we just run away and act like Christ doesn't exist?
That's probably one of the most punk rock treatments of iconography I've encountered yet, and I love
Thanks.
it. But more seriously, like there's an apocalyptic quality to what you're touching on, right? And not in the sort of like, end times,
An unveiling kind of.
yeah.
Yeah.
More of an unveiling than it is a sort of left behind premillennial Earth, like baptized in fire destruction thing. But actually, how is the end being revealed in our midst? And any real divine self-disclosure is one in which there is something new created, but there also is a breaking with what came before.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is right in the territory of Ellul's work is he's describing in his sociological work all of the things that suffocate us, that determine our existence and remove the things that make us most human. And his theological work is the response that the Christian ought to have, and the response that God has, whether the Christian has it or not, ready for us, which is one of fracture that leads to something new that's created, something beautiful that is created. This does remind me of the second example I had, where I was actually invited to do a 15-minute talk at a denominational conference that the school that I work at is a part of, and I used your image of Pentecost
Mm.
because the talk I was asked to do was on, Christianity in a post-Christian era, 15 minutes cover that. So I thought a lot about what I wanted to say, and I was led to Acts 2 with Peter's Pentecost sermon, and he talks about if there are visions coming, and he's engaging with Joel's prophecy, but he says, there are visions coming, but it's not coming to the people that you think it's coming to.
Mm.
It's coming to your sons and your daughters, so young people. It's coming to old people, and it's coming to male and female servants.
Mm.
So I basically said, so if you want to know what the future of Christianity in North America is in a post-Christian era, it doesn't look like me. Doesn't sound like me, doesn't have my background, right? And I said, here it is in visual form, and I showed them your Pentecost image. And what I loved about that image is that it really, it's classic rendering of Pentecost with the fire, the spirit falling and so on. But the people gathered around the table, it's a wide range of age, different ages, different classes, different races, different abilities. Um,
Hmm.
but what was really interesting was the reaction I got to it. Some people came up and said thank you, but some people were really unsettled. And what they really focused on was the race element.
Mm.
So one person pondered if I was actually sort of committing reverse racism. And um, that really unsettled me because I was like, well, race was a part of what I was talking about, but it wasn't the only thing. Like I was talking about age, I was talking about class, I was talking about ability and disability, and
Mm.
yet people hyper focused on the strain of race in the image and Peter's Pentecost sermon. And it makes me wonder, fitting in with this iconoclasm piece, do you view your work as sort of functioning like the classic Rorschach test or the ink blot test? Has anybody ever asked you this before? Because it's kind of when the therapist is showing the patient the ink blots, and they're supposed to tell the therapist, like, here's the first thing that comes to mind. And it's not about getting the image right, as it were,
Hmm.
right? Like, oh, you got it right, so you're not insane, right? It's more about what what are people going to project onto the images in front of them. And this example, to me, shows a little bit of that effect in your work of like, what people are hyper fixated on, that's what they'll go to, for
Mm.
better, for worse. And it may cause them to miss the wider meaning, the wider significance of like what you and how God is trying to speak to people through it.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I think it's interesting, just like all the different comments and yeah, just ways that people have seen a lot of the icons, uh, and what they don't see too. And um, but I think I just have to keep coming back to, again, the word communion is a mutual participation, and this mutual communion or participation in observing work, like like you're just saying, we are so inundated with images in our time, advertisements, screens, billboards, whatever. We're inundated, and we're so quick to speak into or comment on images, and we're doing so much of that in isolation, like so much of it in isolation. But like when we can just stop and observe, and then potentially talk about what we're seeing within the context of community, I think just things are going to come up that we wouldn't expect. And then we're then forced to kind of understand our own sight and what we're immediately looking at. And I think we just are doing so much of that in isolation, so much of looking and observing these things in isolation. And um but I think a lot of the crazier comments I've had have been online, because I think it's just these people who they're by themselves. It's the first thing they see. I did an image of it's based on a mosaic of in the Mount of Olives of Christ, the mother hen with their chicks, and this person was like, I think that looks more like a rooster, actually. Like you're saying that Jesus is more of a rooster, not a hen. I was like, no, like he's called himself a mother hen. But that's what they saw. It's just I don't know. So it's just there's all kinds of like I just have to keep on coming back to people will see what they see, but I think I, I I'm interested in that conversion of sight and spaces and ways that we can kind of help make that happen. And like how do our churches and our communities like make that more possible, and I don't think it's a problem that you know certain people are offended or maybe see one of the images in a different way. I think what's more important is that I just hope that they are able to engage with other people while looking. I don't know. I'm kind of uh, going on in circles now, but I mean, I always keep coming back to that. Like, how do we create more opportunities for that conversion of sight or the dialogue to happen? And I
Yeah.
think so often in our churches specifically, it just it's that's not happening. Those kind of conversations aren't happening. Like the artwork kind of acts as glorified wallpaper, and that's about it. Like there's no engagement. And what if churches brought in, and not even icons, but other types of artwork in, and they they had a patron artist from their community that they helped fund and bring in their artwork to then look at together and talk about every month or whatever. Like I just feel like there's a lot of like ways that we're kind of failing in our imagination and in ways to use artwork and how we connect.
The first thing that comes to mind, I don't think you're going in circles at all, because I think what you're getting at here is as long as we can have a conversation, then there's hope, right?
Right,
And
right.
that was the constructive side of both the examples I gave and the examples you're
Yeah,
giving is at least people are talking in an
yeah.
age where everybody is firing, rounds at each other on social media, throwing grenades at each other, writing them off, dehumanizing people through it.
Mm,
Having the in-person conversation inspired by a piece of art, it almost makes me think about the way in which art can teach us to see each other and speak with each other anew again.
mm,
And I think that's what you're getting at. And this really gets to the heart of Ellul's fear with a hyper technological, image saturated world, is that it means that nobody talks anymore, that true
mm,
dialogue becomes impossible. And when true dialogue becomes impossible, then we're really in trouble because we no longer see our neighbor as our neighbor.
mm,
And so that is at the heart of what he's afraid of, and why he's emphasizing, like, get out of you know, the bubble that you're in. Go
Mm.
and see the person that you live next door to. Get outside and get your hands in the dirt. Remind yourself that you're human and see the other humans around you, and from there see what God is going to do. Um, and I appreciate that you're, as an artist, you're trying to do that. So as we wind down here, I just want to put out to you one final sort of set of questions here: is what excites and or concerns you the most right now? Like,
I think was is after the election, there was this kind of a deep kind of feeling within Evie and I of just there's a lot of people that we love and care about that are really scared about some of the rhetoric coming out about the next Trump administration, and and it just so happened that the week after the election, and this is just kind of the relationships, uh, and I got to say, I mean, I'm an artist and an iconographer, but none of this really means much without the relationships that make life worth living. And through one of the relationships doing this work, we the week after election, we were in a got invited to join a group to go down to the Mexico-U.S. border at a shelter there that hosts migrants and refugees. And I still kind of speechless about that time, but people are really scared. They don't really know what's going to happen to migrants and refugees in this country. And immediately, hearing the stories from the families that and the individuals that were at the shelter, for Evie and I, just like really gave us a resolve that we really want to continue to use uh, the icons in any way that we can to the church for far too long has neglected and even rejected those on the margins of society. And then when it complains about not having enough money or like not enough people in their churches, like whose problem is that? Like, the gifts are there, the people are there. It's just the church has often failed to see. And we've talked about sight a lot in this conversation, but that's I think my main thing, my hope is that I just want to continue to create images that are going to create that dialogue about and challenging our sight about who this church is a stranger in the world made up of strangers, like you know and so really I'm always trying to communicate something, but I think those I've really noticed that especially in this time of unrest, there's a lot of things, a lot of congregations that are made up of for this sake of this conversation, Republican and Democrat, which is very interesting. People that are worshiping together who maybe think very differently about the state of our country and things, but they're still worshiping together. And there's a lot of priests and bishops and other people within the church, professors, that have used our work as a way to kind of say something without saying it, and to kind of create these conversations. And so for every night, I think we're hopeful that the work can continue to be used in this way, and that in some form, again, people can be talking, like you're saying, which is our hope that people will
mm,
just keep talking. That despite of all this fear and kind of um, the potential for unrest and violence towards potentially even women and those the LGBTQI community and migrants and refugees, like there's still a conversation happening, and I think we just want to continue to create images that are going to again create that dialogue, but also uh, continue to find new ways to engage communities through art and our conversations together and connecting in that way. So
yeah,
I'm just hopeful. That's the best way I can say.
your work is a real witness to that, and I
Thank you.
appreciate it, I'm sure I'm speaking for a lot of people when I say thank you for the work that you do, and thanks for this time. This conversation has been great.
Yeah. Thank you, Michael. Yeah, appreciate it.